Well, good evening, everyone. 1 Thessalonians chapter 2. We're going to start there. I know we're supposed to go to Philippians. We will get there eventually, but we're going to start in 1 Thessalonians chapter 2. Appreciate so very much the invitation to come to be a part of this weekend, and have been a part of it, I think, every year but one. So grateful for your continued confidence in me, and hope that as we study together tonight, that you will find the things we talk about from Philippians to be beneficial. I know it was challenging for me in terms of preparing this, in terms of how we are to live. The 1998 movie Saving Private Ryan is set in World War II. And it's a story of Captain John Miller, who's played by Tom Hanks, and he and a small detachment of soldiers is sent on a special mission. And their mission is to locate somewhere on the battlefield or in the theater of war, Private James Ryan, played by Matt Damon, and to send him home. Ryan had three brothers that had already been killed in action, and the Army did not want Mrs. Ryan to lose her last remaining son. Eventually, Miller and his team, they're able to locate Private Ryan. They inform him of their mission. Toward the end of the movie, there's an ensuing battle with German forces in which Captain Miller is mortally wounded. And before he dies, he grabs Private Ryan by the uniform and he pulls him close. And his final words are, "Earn this. Earn it." What he meant was, live your life in a way that's worthy of the sacrifices that have been made. Me and others have given our lives to save yours. And so make the most of it. Don't waste your life. Live in a way that's appropriate for someone who's been rescued by someone else. That scene then transitions to a scene that is decades later. And in the emotional final scene, there is an older Ryan who has gone to Miller's graveside at Normandy Cemetery. His family is standing in the background. And as he stands before Miller's grave marker, he tells him, he says, "I remember your words every day. I've tried to live my life to the very best that I could." Ryan's wife approaches and he says to her, "Tell me I've lived a good life. Tell me I'm a good man." And she says, "You are." As the Apostle Paul wrote to actually a number of churches, he conveys a very similar message, and that is to live in a manner that's appropriate for those who have been rescued from death by means of a sacrifice of another. And in our case, it's not rescued from physical death, but rescued from something far more serious. 1 Thessalonians chapter 2, verse 10 beginning. Paul says, "You are witnesses, and so is God, how devoutly and uprightly and blamelessly we behave toward you believers. Just as you know how we are exhorting and encouraging and imploring each one of you as a father would his own children, so that you would walk in a manner worthy of the God who calls you into his own kingdom and glory." Turn back just one book, Colossians chapter 1. Colossians chapter 1. He begins his book with this as a part of his prayer. Colossians chapter 1, verse 9. He says, "For this reason also, since the day we heard of it, we have not ceased to pray for you and to ask that you may be filled with the knowledge of his will in all spiritual wisdom and understanding, so that you will walk in a manner worthy of the Lord, to please him in all respects, bearing fruit in every good work and increasing in the knowledge of God." A few books back to the left, Ephesians chapter 4. Ephesians chapter 4, let's begin in verse 1. Ephesians chapter 4, verse 1. Paul says, "Therefore I, the prisoner of the Lord, implore you to walk in a manner worthy of the calling with which you have been called, with all humility and gentleness, with patience, showing tolerance for one another in love, being diligent to preserve the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace. And then where we're supposed to be going tonight, Philippians chapter 1. Philippians chapter 1, verse 27, beginning. Philippians chapter 1, verse 27. Only conduct yourselves in a manner worthy of the gospel of Christ, so that whether I come and see you or remain absent, I will hear of you that you are standing firm in one spirit, with one mind, striving together for the faith of the gospel, in no way alarmed by your opponents, which is a sign of destruction for them, but of salvation for you, and that too from God. For to you it has been granted, for Christ's sake, not only to believe in him, but also to suffer for his sake, experiencing the same conflict which you saw in me and now hear to be in me. The point of all of those passages is that everything changes with the gospel. It's supposed to change how we think, how we act, to change our attitudes, our relationships, our speech, our goals, our character, our values. That the gospel is not simply a doctrine that we believe. The gospel is a life that we are to live. The gospel has profound ethical implications upon us. Gospel-driven people are those who enhance the gospel by the manner of life that they live. They enhance the good news. Now, the reality is, how many of us in here are worthy? Not a one of us, right? We are all unworthy. So when Paul writes to these churches, he's not suggesting that we can somehow live in a way that's worthy to earn the benefits of the gospel. He's not speaking of being worthy in a sense of deservedness. But while the gospel is opposed to the attitude of earning, it is not opposed to the exertion of effort. In every one of the passages that we looked at, the Greek word that Paul uses there is exactly the same. And it's a word that had its roots in the ancient marketplace, where on one side of the scale, you would put a weight, and then on the other side of the scale, there would be the goods that were being sold, and when the scale was in balance, then you would cut your deal. Eventually, it came to speak of balancing other things. And so, for example, an employee who is worthy of their pay is someone whose day's worth of work balances with their day's pay. And so in each of these passages that we've just read, Paul is telling his readers to make their behavior balance with what they claim to believe about the gospel, the sacrifice that has been made for them. That be sure, Paul says, that your conduct is consistent with what you say you know and you believe about the gospel of Jesus. Whenever a person joins any organization, they obligate themselves to live in accordance with the beliefs and standards of that group, to accept its goals, to adopt its purposes as his or her own. And so citizens of a country are obligated to abide by the laws of that country to which they belong. Employees are to work in accordance with the rules, the objectives, the mission of the company that employs them. Organizational or service organizational members, such as the Lions Club, are tasked with promoting that club's goals. And Paul has set before each of these churches the great purpose of God in Christ for them. For the Colossians, he's prayed that they would know the wonder of that plan more deeply, and that for all of them, that they would implement it more effectively. That in light of God's love, his grace, his goodness, his mercy, his blessing upon them, Paul exhorts them to live in a way that truly corresponds to the great value and the cost of their salvation. Now, I'll go ahead and get the title up here. That's what we're going to talk about. A little bit of background on Philippians. Okay, Philippians, the church at Philippi, extends back to Acts chapter 16. Paul has set out on his second missionary tour. You remember he and Barnabas had parted ways at the end of chapter 15. And Paul takes Silas and he retraces his steps on the first missionary tour, visiting the churches of Galatia. And in Lystra, Timothy joins him, and we're told in chapter 16 of Acts that the Holy Spirit forbids Paul and his companions from preaching the gospel in Asia. They come to Mysia. They try going into Bithynia, and yet the Spirit doesn't permit them to preach there either. It's interesting. I would love to know the background of how all of that took place. Luke doesn't tell us. They turn west, and they eventually make their way to the port city of Troas. And it's at Troas where Paul has the vision of a Macedonian man appealing to Paul to come and help them. They put out to sea from Troas, they arrive at Neapolis, and from there they make their way to Philippi, a city that Luke describes as a leading city in the district of Macedonia, and also a Roman colony. That's going to play into the things that Paul has to communicate to this church. Eventually, there's a church that's born here. And the members that we know of are a fairly diverse group, right? So who's the member? Who are the charter members of the church at Philippi? Lydia and her household, okay, and Lydia is a seemingly fairly well-to-do Jewish woman, okay, and a jailer, a Gentile jailer and his family, and maybe even slave girl. The slave girl that Paul, remember, he cast the demon out, and that's what gets him into trouble, and he and Silas end up being cast into prison, okay? Those are the charter members of that group, of that church. In spite of the conflict, the struggles that Paul encountered there, it seems that Philippi was one of Paul's favorite congregations, perhaps even his most favorite. This is a group of people who were regularly willing to help support Paul's missionary effort in other places when other churches were either unwilling or unable to do so. During a time when Paul was experiencing challenging relationships with some other churches, the apostles saw their tangible, sacrificial, financial support of his efforts as a reflection not only of their genuine faith, but of their endearing friendship. Paul writes this letter from a prison cell. There's a lot of debate on where that prison cell happens to be. I kind of lean toward it. He's in Rome, awaiting verdict from Caesar. And he pens a very personal letter that is full of the warmth of a relationship that was not only precious to the apostle, but I think significant to the saints that dwelled in Philippi as well. His letter begins with a greeting. The first couple verses, it's interesting. You see all of the components of a local church within those two verses. He then moves into a twofold prayer for them, first of thanksgiving and then intercession. He then begins talking about his own personal circumstances. He is in prison, and yet he says the gospel is continuing to make progress in spite of that. He voices his uncertainty as to what the immediate future for him looks like. If he was to make a selfish choice, Paul says, I would much rather go home to be with the Lord. But he says, I believe that it is for your sakes that I'm going to remain on in the flesh. And with those issues settled, Paul quickly moves to address his primary concerns for this group of people, and that is their spiritual welfare. You'll notice how verse 27 begins. There's no gradual introduction. There's no leading into his theme gently. There is almost a sudden outburst. The word only appears first. This is the first word in verse 27. That's the word monos in Greek. It's paraphrased by Barth as just one thing. Matyer said, only this. The imperatives that follow verse 27 are going to be focused on one thing. And that one thing is the gospel of Christ. The gospel doesn't involve a lengthy list of rules that we're supposed to follow. The gospel centers around the person of Jesus. The story of who he is, the good news of all that he has accomplished for us, and those are the things that supply us with the motive and the pattern as to how we are to behave as his people. Now, do you remember the word that Paul used with both the Ephesians and with the Thessalonians? Blank in a manner that's worthy. You remember the word? Walk. Good. All right, good. Walk. In both of those passages, it uses the word walk. And the New Testament frequently uses that term to describe a consistent, daily life. Here he uses the word conduct. And if we were reading this in Greek, we get our English word politics from this. And it's a word that meant to discharge one's obligations as a citizen, to be citizens. Now, the Roman world had very strong political formations. Certain cities in the Roman Empire were given colony status, which meant that they were to be small-scale versions of Rome itself. And the citizens of a Roman colony took great pride in that status that had been bestowed upon them. Now, as we mentioned earlier, Luke tells us in Acts chapter 16, verse 12, Philippi is a Roman colony. Okay, so even though Philippi is 800 miles away from Rome, Philippi is supposed to be a miniature version of the empire's capital. In terms of its lifestyle in Philippi, its mindset, its culture, its coinage, its language. They spoke Latin. Citizens of Philippi possessed all of the rights and privileges of someone who actually lived in the city of Rome. But they also had all of the responsibilities of someone who lived in Rome. And so when Paul uses this word, it is a word that is pregnant with meaning. And by the way, the letter to the Philippians is the only place in all of Paul's writings where he uses this word. And James will probably talk about in his section tomorrow. By means of this word, Paul is communicating to the church at Philippi, look, you have an even higher responsibility than being a Roman colony. You are a colony of heaven that dwells on earth. And even though you're separated by distance, just as they are from Rome, they are expected to conduct themselves in a manner that is specific, like citizens of heaven would behave. And he adds here in verse 27, that's to be true. You're supposed to live like that whether I come to you or not. It doesn't matter whether I'm present or whether I'm not. That's how you are supposed to live. Now, what comes on the heels of that is three things that Paul says worthy conduct. This is what worthy conduct looks like to Paul. And the first thing that he points out is that they are to have an unshakable resolve. He says, only conduct yourselves in a manner worthy of the gospel of Christ, so that whether I come and see you or remain absent, I will hear of you that you are standing firm. Brothers, if we are going to conduct ourselves in a manner that is worthy of the gospel, what it requires is a stable, consistent, spiritual life. This is, by the way, standing firm translates a military term in the Greek. It was a word that spoke of being at a post. It was used to describe a soldier who was stationed at a particular location, and he was charged with holding that critical position. And it's a marvelous metaphor that transfers so vividly to the life of Christian men. That you and I are called as Christian men to take an unwavering stand where God desires for us to stand, where God has assigned us. Paul is calling for a determined loyalty, an unwavering commitment to things like character and godliness, to purity and holiness and obedience. By the way, this is the same word that Paul uses in Ephesians chapter 6 and verse 11 when he tells the Ephesians, put on the full armor of God so that you may be able to stand firm against the schemes of the devil. A worthy life involves a steadfast commitment to the gospel, a commitment that refuses to compromise, that refuses to melt under pressure. But that resolve depends upon knowledge and understanding, doesn't it? We have to know why we're standing where we are. And you remember, what did Paul pray for with the Colossians? He prayed that they would be filled with all knowledge and wisdom. When we talk about someone who is filled with wrath, filled with anger, filled with jealousy, what's the point being made? If you're filled with it, there's no room for anything else. You are controlled by that one emotion. Paul's prayer for the Colossians, in which he says, so that you will live worthy of the gospel or walk worthy of the gospel, is is that they be saturated, they be completely filled with the knowledge of God's will. What is it that controls us? Paul says what is to control us is a deep, thorough, complete knowledge of God's will and his wisdom. That equips us to walk in a manner that's worthy, or as he told the Colossians as well, to be in all aspects pleasing to him. But notice Paul goes on. He doesn't just say stand firm, period. He says stand firm in one spirit. He's not asking the Philippians, hey, you have to stand all by yourself. Now, there may be times where that happens. But his exhortation here is you stand arm in arm with the other saints in Philippi. Christians in Philippi, you need to persevere in the face of opposition, and you need to understand that that opposition is not simply intended to destroy your personal faith. That opposition is also designed to divide your fellowship. And therefore, in the face of adversaries, they are not to give in, they are not to back down, they are not to allow themselves to become divided. They were to be unshakable in their determination, and that's where Paul moves next. The worthy life is a life that promotes unity. Notice how Paul stacks up his terms here. Standing firm in one spirit, with one mind, literally in the Greek, one soul, striving together. And so Paul, he goes from a political word to a military word to an athletic word. Striving together translates a word from which we get our word athlete or athletics. And it provides a very realistic portrait of what is involved when it comes to unity. And that is, it's a picture of the body of believers at Philippi as a team that is striving against a common opponent in an effort to be victorious. True unity is not maintained in a static atmosphere. And what that means is if we just stand around and do nothing and think, well, we're going to be unified because we're not arguing or anything. No, it doesn't work that way. You will never achieve it. The only way to have true unity is for everyone to be striving together to reach a common goal, a common objective. But there's even more than that. The word striving there, that there is a desperation about winning. So much so that there's no concern over those peripheral issues. As the old saying goes, if everyone in the boat is trying to row the boat, there isn't anybody with enough time to rock the boat. Any coach knows that the key to victory is having an entire team focused on the goal of winning, so much so that the only concern that anyone on the team has is how are we going to get there? Why is it that sports teams that have the highest payroll and seemingly on paper some of the greatest players that have ever played can't win a World Series or can't win a Super Bowl? Why is that? They're not playing as a team. They're simply not playing on his team. The issue, Paul, it's not about who gets the credit. It's not about who gets to do what. It's not about who gets to be in charge. In fact, it's not even, do I really like the person sitting next to me? In order to have unity, there has to be complete buy-in on what it means to be part of a team. And it's trite, but it's true. There's no I in team, right? Each person simply looking to fulfill their role to the benefit of everyone else. And if there's a glory seeker, and if there's someone who is selfish or factious or divisive on your team, you are destined to lose. And in the process, they may well even destroy the team. We've seen that, haven't we, among ourselves? Now, look over at Philippians, we're in Philippians. Look at Ephesians. Turn back a few pages, Philippians chapter 4. Ephesians chapter 4. I'm doing okay when I catch myself. When I get to where I don't catch myself, I tell the folks at home, look, you know what I mean. Just go with it, okay? In Ephesians, in Paul's reference here to walking in a manner that's worthy, he lists 4 qualities that mark out the one who's doing that. And I want you to notice that all 4 of those qualities contribute significantly to the promotion of unity. So Paul talks about walking worthily in Philippians, and he ties it into unity. Here, Paul ties it into unity as well. But here he includes the attitudes. And you'll notice here that unity doesn't come because of pressure that is exerted from without. It comes as a result of attitudes that are formulated from within. And he says, verse 1, walk in a manner worthy of the calling with which you've been called, with all humility and gentleness, with patience, showing tolerance for one another in love. He starts with humility. The word means to think or to judge with lowliness, and therefore have a lowliness of mind, to recognize the value and the worth of others. Now, what I find interesting is that in Paul's day, the Greeks and the Romans never used this word in a context of approval, and certainly never in terms of admiration. And yet, if there is one sin that God would put at the head of the class, what sin would that be? Arrogance and pride, okay? Arrogance and pride, because arrogance and pride pretty much lie behind every other sin that's committed. As one fellow says, pride's the only disease known to man that makes everyone sick except the person who has it. Paul will go on to say, well, I'm not going to step on you too much here, Jordan. Paul's going to go on to say in chapter 2, beginning in verse 5, he's going to point to the example of Jesus and say, look, the essence of humility is to subordinate our personal agenda to the benefit of other people. And here in Ephesians, he says it's a key to unity. Unity, whether it's in the church or whether it's in our homes. We're to be humble men in either of those places. When I was in school, they gave me a button because I was the most humble kid in school, and then they took it away from me because I wore it. The people at home have wearied of that. I don't even finish it anymore. But I think a new audience here, I could use it. Look at the next, gentleness. Gentleness. In the only self-description that Jesus ever gives of himself, how does he describe himself? No. Personal. Humble and gentle and humble in heart. The first 2 qualities that Paul points to here are the 2 qualities that Jesus in Matthew chapter 11 and verse 29 points to as himself. Gentleness is the 3rd beatitude, Matthew 5 and verse 5. It is one of the fruit of the Spirit, or a fruit of the Spirit in Galatians chapter 5 and verse 24. Does being humble and gentle, does that sound very manly to you? Nobody wants to bite on that one, huh? In our culture, it says no. Our culture says no. God says, look, if you want to live worthily, if you want to be a real man, you'll be humble and you'll be gentle. And the word here, of course, you probably know this one, right? What does gentleness mean? Power under control. The word is used to describe a horse that had been broken. So the horse has tremendous power, but now when it's broken, the power isn't wasted. It's harnessed for the good of the rider or the farmer. And of course, here it's not simply power under control, but in specific, it's power under God's control. Gentleness describes the right way to respond to conflict and quarrel, to rejection and injustice. That when harsh words are spoken to us, we don't respond with bluster or self-defense or hostility or anger, but we respond with a sensitivity to the feelings of other people. Gentleness is born of incredible power. This is not talking about weakness. It's a demonstration of great strength, not timidity. It is deeply courageous. It's not cowardly. And it contributes a great deal to the promotion of unity. I'm behind myself here a little bit. Patience is the next one. Being willing to accept delay or disappointment and do it with grace. to respond with a pleasant and understanding spirit in the face of setbacks, to remain calm when other things and other people are contrary. Paul uses a compound word here in the Greek, macrothumia. Macro, long or far, anger, or thumia, wrath or anger. And so Paul's calling us here to be long-angered rather than to be someone with a short fuse. It is a trait that refuses to be broken by either aggravating circumstances or to be embittered by aggravating people. And it doesn't come easily, does it? Again, another quality that's tender but is very tough. A quality that requires a tremendous amount of strength and self-control as we exercise our reactions to people and circumstance. This is not about just gritting our teeth kind of patience. It's a resolve that we're going to take in the bigger picture. We're going to measure this situation. We're going to measure this person by seeing them through the eyes of God. And then, oops, I messed that one up. All right, here we go. Forbearing love. This one is also demanded both within our families and our fellowships, isn't it? Because people will behave in ways that annoy you. Surprise, right? People will do things that will irritate you, that will get under your skin, that will hurt you, that will disappoint you, that will injure you. We understand that a critical spirit is caustic, and it's sinful, that it wrings the joy out of other people's lives, that it's toxic to relationships. But in home and at church, we fall into that trap very quickly, don't we? There was a family, they were on their way home after church. Dad was in the car. He was talking about how the preacher preached too long and he's boring anyway. And Mom, she piped up and she said, well, that elder's wife, she didn't even talk to me today. And the little girl in the back seat, she says, yeah, the kids in class, they ignored me. They didn't pay any attention to me at all. And the little boy pipes up and he says, look on the bright side. It only cost us $2. Forbearing love speaks of tolerance, of self-restraint, of choosing to view others favorably rather than critically, of bearing with each other's weaknesses. And when we do that, unity, or without it, unity is impossible. With it, unity is very possible. And without it, we have failed to conduct ourselves in a manner that's worthy of the gospel. Now, you'll notice that even with those 4 foundation stones that contribute to unity, Paul continues, because unity doesn't come, okay, you just got these, there has to be some effort. In fact, he goes so far as to say in verse 3, being diligent to preserve the unity of the Spirit and the bond of peace. The word spoke of making haste, and it came to describe a zeal that demanded a person's full dedication. Paul's not looking for some sort of organizational kind of unity that we see promoted in the world. He's not talking about ecumenical unity where doctrinal differences are ignored in the name of unity. But neither is he describing a unity that is attained solely by human effort. He's talking about a unity that is given by God and maintained by human submission to the will of God. In chapter 2 of Ephesians, you remember Paul talked about the cross and how it tore down the dividing wall between Jew and Gentile. Paul's telling the Ephesians, and he's telling us as well, look, we need to live worthily means, look, we're never going to try and rebuild any kind of wall between us and other people. Paul connects unity to conduct that's worthy of the gospel. And we're familiar as well that the Bible contains numerous warnings about living in the opposite way, promoting discord, dissension, divisiveness. In fact, sowing discord among brothers, Proverbs chapter 6, verse 16 and following, is one of the things that God hates. In fact, God calls it an abomination in that passage. Paul said in Romans 16 and verse 17 to turn away from those who cause dissension. Titus chapter 3, verse 10, 11, Paul says turn away from a factious person. In fact, he calls them self-condemned. If we're living worthy of the gospel, we are not going to be those kind of men. And that's true whether we're at home or whether we're in a church. Now, go back to Philippians. Because I want you to notice, Paul isn't just talking about unity for unity's sake, but unity for a particular purpose. Notice what he says here. He says, standing firm in one spirit with one mind, verse 27, striving together for the faith of the gospel. He's describing faith here. It's a reference to an objective body of truth that has been given to the church. Jude verse 3 is a familiar passage that we are to contend earnestly for the faith that was once for all delivered to the saints. Paul's in essence saying, look here, the main thing has to always be the main thing. Our conviction that we are standing firm on is the faith of the gospel. That's what motivates us. That's our unifying principle. That's the basis of our solidarity. The gospel is our common goal and our common desire. But when self takes center stage, when it becomes my feelings or my rights or my prominence or my position, when that becomes the chief concern, then unity simply can no longer exist and the church becomes ineffective. But when we're united in our determination to be victorious, when we're resolute in achieving our objectives, when we're focused on going home together victoriously, when we're inextricably linked together as one, united in the gospel, then unity doesn't just exist, it thrives. And then Paul closes that a worthy life is a life of unfazed confidence. Because when you live that way, there can be a price to be paid. Verse 28. He says, in no way be alarmed by your opponents. There has to be a confident courage. It's easy to be bold and strong on a Sunday morning or on a Friday night of a men's weekend. But what about Monday or Tuesday or Thursday or Friday? The word that Paul uses here, by the way, alarmed, is never used anywhere else in the New Testament. It's used in classical Greek to describe horses that have been startled or frightened on a battlefield. And so I came across one paraphrase, don't be stampeded by your opponents. I thought that was a pretty vivid image of, everybody in the church just sort of running in the opposite direction of the battle. We're not to be intimidated by our opponents in any way, because no matter how powerful the opposition, when we stand side by side, we shouldn't be scared by any threat. And Paul provides 3 pieces of encouragement to instill courage in them. Verse 28, Paul says battles help to validate our salvation. Paul calls it a sign, he says, which is a sign of destruction for them, but of salvation for you, and that too from God. People inside and outside the church view the same thing in a different way. Those on the outside interpret it as impending destruction for us, it seems, is what is in mind. For us on the inside, it's instead seen as a sign of salvation, that we must be doing something right if the world is standing against us. And I think it's a little easier to see that distinction at the cross. At the cross, Jesus' enemies believe they have destroyed him. In reality, a different crowd looks at the cross and they see it in a very different way, don't they? We see it as a sign of salvation. Verse 29, he says, battles are a privilege. For you it has been granted for Christ's sake, not only to believe in him, but also to suffer for his sake. Now, you don't want to hear this, what Paul says here. When Paul says it has been suffering and conflict have been granted to us, he uses the form of the word charis. We get grace from that. We translate that grace. Paul says, look, it's a gift to suffer for the sake of Jesus. And then verse 30, it doesn't respect people. He says, you're experiencing the same conflict which you saw in me and now here to be in me. They are suffering some of the exact same things that Paul did when he was in Philippi. The word conflict there, by the way, we get our word agony from that. Paul's suffering, however, if you go back and you look at chapter 1, verse 12 through 14, Paul says, look, my suffering has actually turned out for the benefit of the gospel. I'm in prison, but the Praetorian Guard is hearing the gospel, and other people on the outside who are free see me, and if they say, if Paul can do that in chains, then I can do it in my freedom. Both Paul and the Philippians are engaged in a life and death struggle. The men who are looking to live worthily of the gospel enhance it by their conduct. We genuinely reflect our faith. Our faith is real to us. It's not some facade we put on a Sunday morning. They pursue unity that genuinely reveals God's presence among them. And they possess a confidence that dispels any fear. And as we close, is that an accurate portrayal of who we are? Are we enhancing the gospel by how we live? And not just how we live at home, but how we treat other people inside the walls of a church building, but also outside the walls of the church building. And so when we as Christians, some poor girl cashier at the checkout line, and we give her a piece of our mind that we can't afford to lose, are we enhancing the gospel with that? Or are we taking away from it? Are we, in terms of pursuing unity, what effort are we willing to make to do that? What kind of people are we trying to be in order to promote unity of the group that we worship with or within our own homes? How do we live when circumstances are hard? When things go wrong? Do we regularly demonstrate our courage from our conviction that our God is King? Now, unlike what Captain John Miller said, we don't earn this. But even though we don't earn it, there is very clearly a divine expectation that we live in a way that's worthy of the great sacrifice that's been made to save us. I close with that. 10-minute break, Ricky said.